Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
And at this point, normally we do a whole spiel, which for the last, I think it's 140 or so episodes, we've used to explain what the podcast is about. And I had a moment of epiphany when I was listening to back one of our episodes, which is if people don't know what we're all about by now, there's 140 episodes they can go back to. So how about that for our shortened introduction this week, Gareth?
Yeah, I'm also quite staggered that 140 episodes in, we still do it live every time rather than just cut and paste in a pre-recorded.
So this episode is one of those ones where it's half planned and half not planned.
So normal then.
No, don't listen to him, everyone. We normally actually very, very carefully plan most, if not some, of our episodes before we start talking. I love this because we get lots of feedback about people who go on long drives and listen to this when they're heading back to work or heading home. And so many people who know us will be giggling at that point about knowing how much we plan. Anyway, getting back to the episode, one of the things that struck me and that we don't talk about very much because it's another one of these topics where there's almost a stiff upper lip about it, is the topic of transitions. And there's one particular transition that I'll lead on this episode because I have recently experienced it. I think it's interesting to talk about and how I'm thinking about it and approaching it. I don't know whether it comes under the standard heading of leadership, but it's certainly something that's been taking up lots of time and effort. But let's start with a couple of examples by what I mean by transition. That's probably a good place to start. And the reason why I say that is I'm going to talk about my specific transition, but actually there's lots and lots of transitions that we go through all the time. So the first one is when you start a new role and you go into a new industry. That's big. And there's an element of excitement, imposter syndrome, building credibility. So that's actually quite a big transition.
Yep.
I think lots of people would recognize as a transition. Here's another one, and maybe we can come back and talk about some of these a little bit later. Promotion into leadership. That's a huge transition that I've talked about with team members, which requires a shift in thinking. And I remember when I was a little bit younger, it's this idea of someone sort of tapping you on the shoulder and said, okay, you're now going to lead people. You're no longer one of the lads. You now have to lead the lads. And that requires a very, very different way of thinking as well. You know, that individual contributor to manager, the shifting from I'm doing something to now I need to enable and nurture a team to grow. I've got lots of others. I mean, Gareth, probably there's one that's reasonably obvious to me, and that's the transition from military to civilian world. Presumably that was a big one for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from a military perspective, I would say there's two major transitions. One is obviously three actually, because there's transition from civilian to military. And that's a big personal journey that people go on when they go through basic training. And we can talk about why and how that happens. Then, of course, as you say, the transition out of the military career, the military life, into a civilian career. And that's really important because for most people leaving the military, their whole experience of employment, their whole experience of effectively adulting has been within the context of military life, which is a very, very, in some respects, demanding lifestyle, career choice with a lot of responsibility. But in other respects, you have a lot of sort of normal adulting taken care. So you don't need to worry too much about things like council tax, because living in military accommodation, that's not a thing you've ever had to do. Paying bills. For a lot of people leaving the military who've not got married and moved into married quarters, they probably still live on camp, which is very similar to, probably very similar to, university digs so the idea of going out into the wide world, getting a new job, but also having a new way of living your life. So it's quite a big thing. But then the third one, of course, is the military sort of somewhat uniquely, or certainly it's an unusual thing. It doesn't happen so much in other walks of life, every 2 to 3 years, you get ripped out of your current job, thrown to another part of the country, if not another part of the world, and plunked into a new job for the next 2 to 3 years. And so there's this constant churn. And we talked about the role of handovers and legacy when you leave an organisation and join a new organisation. But for the military, that is a continual thing. So there are 3 sort of transitions. The transition in, the internal transitions that are pretty consistent throughout your career, and then the transition out at the end.
I mean, I think this is fascinating. And maybe the point of this opening piece is to talk about the fact that transitions are more common than we might imagine. It's funny, you were talking about the military one. I still have this visceral memory of being in a queue of cars outside Dartmouth Royal Naval College, a young, I think I was 20, 21 maybe, with an ironing board in the back of my car. And I think it's safe to say absolutely shitting myself.
Yeah.
Because to your point, this was, you talk about sort of the change in adulting, leaving the military. Of course, joining the military, it's the reverse on the other side. There's another one as well. So my son has just finished his A-levels. And it's really interesting to see his transition out of that, which, while there are obviously clear differences, doesn't feel that different to the whole military transition, which is he has got up for the last 18 years of his life and had his life programmed for him. He knows what he's got to do. He knows how he's got to do it. And so obviously he's worked with like everyone at school or even potentially university. I guess university changed a little bit. And all of a sudden, the day after he finished school, what are you going to do tomorrow? Well, I don't know. And so he's in this process of thinking about and managing that transition.
I think there's a really important point there as well, because we're talking about this as if it's a specific thing, but that point, the transitions are something that everybody goes through, small or large. And you said earlier, I'm not sure if it's a specific leadership thing. It's really interesting how little we talk about managing transitions, either personally from a leadership point of view, or in order to enable and support people in your team transitioning. I think it is absolutely a leadership thing. Hence why we're sort of doing a whole podcast episode on it. But I think it's really important to recognise that it starts early, and it doesn't necessarily start with the workplace.
Well, and it's the reason why this is, we'll come on to the personal reason why it's fascinating in a minute, but these things are really, really important that you manage these transitions well, both for professional reasons as well as personal reasons. For professional reasons, you need to be able to be flexible. You need to be able to shift your thinking quite dramatically sometimes, in inverted commas, at short notice as you go from one thing to another.
Yeah.
You need to be able to shift into different patterns of work. Actually managing transitions well, whether you're just leaving school or whether you've just been promoted, has a huge impact on your success in your next step, whatever that might be. And just a couple more transitions. Returning after a break, which I want to come back to in a second. Entrepreneurship, when you move from being an employee to a founder, which is radically different. And
very much so.
I've got some friends who have moved on to become CEOs and started their own businesses. Very interesting to talk about that. Late career shifts as people transition literally from, I used to do this month and now I'm going to go and do a very different career. And of course, then there's geographical cultural transitions on myself. This is now 20 years ago. Oh my God, that sounds bad. 20 years ago, myself and my wife moved to the US to go work for a US company. So it's huge. I'm going to come back to the return after a break as well, because I think you can tell from, as we've talked previously about these episodes, that I try to think carefully about things I experience wherever they are to try and understand them. And there's a transition which I think we haven't mentioned, but which frankly, I think for half the population, I don't know what the statistics are, maybe less, is almost the biggest transition, which is parents to no longer being full-time parents. And what I mean by that is my wife, she's very, very good. She had a professional career. when we had our kids, she paused that professional career to look after the kids. And we're very lucky. That was a conversation we had. There was an opportunity for me to earn a certain amount of money. That was all great. What's fascinating, though, is we went from the point where to look after your children, the job was to keep them alive every second of the day. And if you didn't pay attention, something catastrophic would happen, to the point now where I've got an 18 and a 15-year-old who frankly couldn't give a stuff if we're around or not, which is great, which is fantastic. And it's the natural thing. But all of a sudden, the transition which I spotted with my wife and many friends is the transition from mum, where you're called mum and you're recognized as the parents of, in my case, Will and Charlie, all the way back to who is that person and the transition there. And I frankly, I see many mums struggling with that, partly, I think, because no one ever sits them down and says, here's a transition. You need to think about what you want to do. And I see some mums that have managed to transition back into a career or said, I don't want a career, but I'm going to do these things. And I've seen other mums that, you still see them struggle. So it's funny. These transitions are everywhere and they have a much, much more significant impact than you might think about these things. And of course, the last one, it's the classic case. I wrote a bunch of notes, and as we're going through it, I think more. The last really important one is retirement.
Yeah.
I remember that seemingly for when my father retired, and it felt like for that generation, I'm sure I'll be told I'm wrong, but at least for some people, retirement meant stopping getting up at 8 o'clock every morning and going to work, or whatever time you get up. And it was get up whenever you need to get up and sit in front of the television. And that was the transition. Whereas I think, I'm 54 now. There's a point in my future, and that's another transition. So turns out these transitions, while we're talking in terms of business primarily, I think, actually they're more common than you might think. They are way more personally significant, and they have the ability to sort of go quite wrong sometimes. But also it's really important to get them right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's sort of two broad categories, aren't there? There are those transitions that are sort of natural transitions as part of the process of life. Children growing up, leaving home, people retiring. These are kind of natural transitions that most people will experience in some capacity. And then there are those transitions that are a choice or not, but happen as a result of change quite abruptly sometimes within the work or life environment. And there's a difference between transitions where it's personal, I have grown up, I am about to leave home, to positional, I am going to leave this role. Because if you're leaving a role, somebody else is going to come and step into that role. So there's three people or three groups of people that are involved in that transition. The person leaving, the person joining, and the person overseeing the transition. So there's a huge responsibility for the management and leadership of an organization as transitions happen to make sure they're done well. And both in terms of the people, and most organizations will talk about people being their most important asset. We put our people first. Well, a transition is when you really test that, because for the person leaving, there's no long-term benefit to the organization, or there's no direct long-term benefit to the organization of managing out that person correctly. So it's very easy to say, we care about you. You are our most important asset. Oh, you're leaving. Right, you're on your own.
Well, we'll come back to talk about that. Just a point to start with, which is when anyone has left an organization, everyone gets very excited about the handover. And I've realized that the handover is an odd, it doesn't quite behave in the way you would either expect it to or it should do.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, here is a person who has spent many years in this role, has a massive amount of collected information, and a handover frequently is a small number of pages in a Word document,
Yeah.
or a 15-minute conversation. And it always feels a bit like, not only is it possible to have an effective and useful handover, but the second thing I'm very aware of is, and I'm pretty sure on this, many people I've worked with have written handovers. I myself have done one which was, I think it was 18 pages, I am pretty sure no one will ever read that handover. That's telling in a couple of ways in terms of how important was that information. But actually, most people then need to live it themselves.
Yeah. So we talked about this a little bit when we were up at RAF Cranwell with the Cheddar Leadership Academy. And we talked a little bit about the role of a leader in making an organisation better than when you found it, but also better as you leave it, it continues to be better. So you don't become the linchpin that when you leave it all falls apart. It's really interesting. I said the military, we kind of do these handovers every 2 years or so when we get a job posting. And so there's this constant churn. And I've done many handovers. I've been the person joining a new organisation. I've obviously also been the person leaving. And I always take it relatively seriously. And I'm the sort of person that thinks several weeks in advance of that handover about what would I want to know, what didn't I know when I joined, and I make copious notes, and then I plan all these things. And I've had situations where people have come in and been very grateful for that, and absolutely been sort of falling on my every word, asking lots of questions. And then I've had people who've come in and said, cool, thanks for doing all this, but I'm going to do this my way. All I need to know is, where's the telephone? Where's my desk? And I'll take it from here, thanks, and I'll learn. I don't think there is a right or wrong. I think it's a very personal thing.
I wonder whether there's a mix here. So there are clearly roles where certain elements you absolutely have to have a handover. I have a relationship with these 5 organizations. I manage that relationship. I have to tell you who I'm managing.
Yeah.
Contact. There's a mechanical. If you don't have
functional bit,
yeah. Thank you. If you don't have this information, then you cannot be successful. There's a second bit though, where I think there's and for so many of these transitions, and we'll come on to my one in a second. For so many of these transitions, there's a how people think these transitions should occur. So could you imagine if someone was leaving and you said to them, yeah, don't worry about handover? That would be really weird. You would get really weird looks. And yet, as we've said, for many of these transitions, for many of these handovers, in this particular case, maybe you don't need anything from them. And yet, I don't know anyone, I've never come across in my entire career, either when I've handed over stuff or other people handed stuff, where anyone has actually said, you know what, don't worry, I need these 4 things off you, but don't worry about the rest of the stuff. That's really interesting. That's the perception of what we should do.
So we talked about sort of functional things, like who are your clients, who are the people that you need to talk to. If I need a piece of paper stamped, which office do I go to? There's functional kind of process and stuff. And then there's the handing over of relationships. How do these people behave? How do these people like, how does the boss like to be informed about things? Is he or she quite an informal person, or are they quite formal? Those kind of things. I mean, I've had situations where the person joining has said, functional, cool, here's the schedule, this is how we have these meetings every Thursday morning, and these things happen, and this is where you go and make your tea and coffee, and you pay your £1 a week, and right, cool, I get the function. I don't care about any of that emotional relationship stuff, because my relationship with those people will be different. I'll work that out. And actually the working it out is important, which I can understand. But I think having a discussion about how the predecessor had a relationship is informing and it's useful. It might not be the same as the way you do it, but it's a good starter. If you've got I worked in an organisation where the boss, the military organisation, so the commander, was a particularly difficult character. I've mentioned them before on this podcast when we talked about toxic leadership. And handovers in that organisation were particularly important because if you didn't get it right early with this particular commander, that was probably you tarred with a brush for the entirety of your 2-year stint in that organisation, which is 2 reports, it's 2 years of experience towards promotion. It's pretty important. And also, if you are on the wrong side of your boss, it's 2 years of pretty miserable living. So that was quite important. I've worked in organisations more often thankfully, in the military, where the commanders have been very relaxed, very easy to get along with. And actually that bit's been less important. The culture of the organisation is such that people are welcomed in. It's recognised that they're new in post and they don't know everything, and everybody puts an arm around them and sort of helps them for the first few weeks. So I think it's really important to judge it based on the individual characters of the people involved, but also the culture of the organisation.
Well, look, we've hedged around. We gave some examples around transition. We've hedged around what those transitions are. Here's the transition that made me want to talk about things. So last month I was made redundant.
Yep.
And in my career, I've been very lucky. I've worked in different organizations and I've made choices to leave. This was the first time that I've actually been made redundant. And as part of that process, other members of my team were made redundant as well. And so what triggered this was, as you might imagine, I'm very thoughtful about what this means in that transition. And that's what really triggered this. So there's a couple of thoughts that I've sort of written down about how I'm going about it and how I'm thinking about it, precisely for what we said earlier. How do I set myself up for the future? How do I manage both professionally and personally this transition? I thought just before we go to the break, it might be interesting to talk about the emotional effect.
Yeah.
Because again, unless it's happened to you, each of these different kinds of transitions have a different emotional experience to them. So traditionally, when I've left an organization, it's almost exciting. I've been very lucky. I don't think I've ever left an organization where I was angry or disappointed. It was more that there was another opportunity ahead of me. And so in that case, it was quite exciting. I knew what I was going to do. I knew when I was going to do it. I knew how I was going to do it. All of a sudden, though, this transition for me, the redundancy, in a sense, well, not in a sense, I literally wasn't expecting. And actually, I don't have another role to immediately go to. Now, I'll be absolutely fine. I'll find something else. That's all good. But the emotional effect was really, really interesting on me. And we're not that long into the sort of the period that I've been taking some time off. And one of the things that I was very keen to do is I've been working for 35 years, was literally to have a little bit of time to recharge. But there's a whole host of emotions that have gone with it. And by the way, first thing I should say is the organization that I was working with were excellent to me. I was well prepared. In fact, I knew for quite a long time that it was happening. I could plan about it. It was if you can have a good redundancy, it was a good redundancy.
And it's probably worth highlighting for your reputation on the podcast, but also for the context that you weren't made redundant as a result of anything going wrong from your particular team. It was a restructuring of the organisation.
My CV is going to say. No, it was a restructuring of the organisation,
and that's quite common, isn't it?
But your point is a really good one, because the first thing that happens, and this is maybe a little bit less leadership and management and more about sort of a personal experience. You are absolutely right. The first thing that goes through your head and continues to go through my head, even though logically and rationally I know it's not true, is it me?
Yeah.
Is it me? And the reality is, it's very clear that there was a rationalization of the organization. There was a change in what they needed, and so that. But it's really interesting because I've made other people redundant before.
Yeah.
It just didn't connect with me how personal that can feel. And in fact, I've now, and again, as part of my redundancy, there are others, I can see how personally that was taken by many people. There are some people who are very good and could say, I understand. And there are others where they really, really struggle because, hang on a minute, it was all fine last month and now it's not all fine. That's very difficult. Now, that's the emotional response to this. But there's a very practical thing, which is, well, hang on a minute. I want to be a good, strong, practical leader. The honest answer is I don't have space in my head to doubt and wonder. But actually, you almost can't help it. So this goes back to why I thought the transitions were so interesting, is because of that feeling. So interesting feeling that you're leaving. There was a handover, fascinating and completely understandable. And I want to reiterate this before I go any further. I'm going to be talking about my most recent employer. They were tremendous. The organization was tremendous. The people around me were tremendous. So there's no negative feeling. In fact, I would almost go back and say this was the perfect way to do it, if there can be a perfect way to do it. But it was so interesting. My departure was announced 3 weeks before I left.
Yeah.
At that point, the organization subconsciously made a decision that I was no longer important.
Yeah.
Even though I was there for another couple of weeks and there were some things I was doing in that period of time, it was really interesting to see that already people subconsciously were saying, Chris is the wrong person to go talk to about this decision.
Yeah.
I need to go find another person. So that was very interesting, which was, as a person leaves, very quickly people make decisions about leadership and ownership.
Yes. Yeah.
Things.
And I imagine if you had have been let go of, made redundant, fired because of something you've done, either performance just not keeping up, or perhaps even worse, some sort of disciplinary thing, then that would be even more the case. People would be.
Yeah, I mean, but I think at that point you'd be out of the door very quickly. Mine was a slightly unusual situation.
But that
I was around.
But it's still important because, yes, the company would probably want to get you out the door quickly because they want to get rid of you because you're not performing. But the void is still there. The transition, the handover is still important. In the company I work for at the moment, recently there's been sort of, I wouldn't say a spate, but several people have resigned to go on to do other things. And they've resigned, so it's their choice. And the company has been brilliant about managing them, but also brilliant about managing all the rest of us, keeping us informed, not necessarily telling us lots of detail that we don't perhaps need to know, but managing that transition from the rest of us who are still part of the organisation and have to get on with that daily business. But what's I think interesting is that psychological element of, if you are let go, then you have to try and stay part of the team until you go. Yeah. The company is probably starting to think about who's next and rightly so, shifting priorities. If you are choosing to go, you personally are probably now thinking about where you're going next. So these people have resigned because they've got offers and jobs elsewhere coming up. So their mind is going to be on their family, their new role, setting the right impressions, and the handover they're about to receive joining an organisation. And yet they've still got that responsibility to
keep going,
tie up all the loose ends, do the handover and keep going. So I think what's really important is to recognise why these transitions have come about.
Let's take a quick break. I want to come back and just talk about one more thing that was a slight surprise to me before I talk about sort of the post-exit phase, because I think there's something interesting there. So we'll come back straight after the break and we'll keep talking, very odd for me to say, about my redundancy.
Cool. See you after the break. Bye-bye.
Welcome back. And I don't know whether you spotted that, but when I said about my redundancy, Gareth said, cool. I think that was a bit of a slip there, Gareth, wasn't it? Here was another thing which was slightly surprising to me. And when I left, one of the things that they wanted to do, because there'd been quite a significant change in the organization, one of the reasons why I stayed perhaps a little bit longer than people might have expected was to support my team.
Yeah.
Both support the people leaving, but also there were some people staying behind in the team. And what was really interesting was a number of them asked me questions as their leader. And there was almost the implication that now they could trust my answers. Now, I'd like to think I'm a pretty honest, straightforward guy and people trust me. So please don't think what I'm implying is Nobody trusted me when they worked for me. And then when I was leaving, but it was very interesting where we would have the same conversations we had before. And there was almost this sense of, you've told us some information that is positive. I was actually very positive to them. And they said, oh, you've got nothing to lose now.
Yeah.
And so therefore we would expect you perhaps to be more negative or be more realistic. That was really interesting. Now I need to reflect on that, which is, I mean, it's absolutely fine. And that was part of the point, was for me to be there, for me to be able to say to the team, no, this is what I think is going to happen. This is why I think it's good news for you going forward.
And I think
I don't know. I wonder whether I've missed a trick, which is, in an ideal world, I would want them to believe those kinds of things without me having to leave for them to believe it, if that makes sense.
It does, but I think there's a natural sort of freedom that comes with being outside of an organisation, or just about to be on the outside of an organisation. So, you sit with politicians, don't you, all the time? Politicians, trust is so important in the world of politics, and being trustworthy and serving with integrity is kind of the epitome of how to get it right. Arguably, there are lots of examples of people that don't do that, and trust in politics is not in a great place right now. But you see people who've left, certainly left the front benches and remain on as backbench MPs, or people who've left entirely, doing interviews, and they are far more free about their own personal views on things. They're still loyal to the party, they're still loyal to the job they once did, but they have a certain freedom now that you don't have when you are talking as part of the organisation.
The nuance there is, and to your point, funnily enough, I was saying exactly the same things before I left as to after.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity, to say it this way, and this comes on to sort of further transition. There's an opportunity for me in my next organisation to somehow narrow the gap.
Yes. Yeah, I see that.
Well, you would say that because you're
a
director or you're a VP, versus, oh, I see you've got nothing to lose. You've said exactly the same thing. Oh, you weren't joking when you said it. There's something there.
There is. And I think whether you're saying something different because you're tempering your own personal opinions because it's unprofessional, or whether you're not and you're saying exactly what you would say anyway, the fact that you no longer are part of this organisation or have any kind of...
maybe it's a double check for them. Maybe it's now we can ask you...
If you don't have skin in the game, like, your opinion is more trustworthy. And I don't think that reflects on you and your relationships. I think it's just a reflection of the organisation and the relationship you have, and then until you don't. I think also what's a really important part of transition is knowing when to let go.
Yeah, that's so I was extraordinarily lucky, and I said this to a couple of people, and I recognize this, which is I left my organization in an almost unbelievably zen place.
Yeah.
I'd worked at the company for a period of time. Redundancy was fine. Financially, it wasn't. And I've been there in the past where leaving an organization meant, could I pay the bills next month? I wasn't there. That was very good. Likewise, I didn't feel someone had done this to me. I didn't feel, all those things.
Yeah.
But what I'm so genuinely, in fact, I think people were a bit suspicious of me that I wasn't depressed and sad. I realized, though, I was very, very lucky in that actually, and this is very important. If anyone's been through a redundancy process, this may well feel very familiar, which is, I think a lot of people leave angry. And I don't mean physically angry, but there is an organization, this was language actually I used when people talked about this, which was, when you leave as part of redundancy, you have no agency. And the whole thing of our lives is we want to have the ability to control our future.
Yeah.
So when you say, I've found another job and I want to leave, that's your control. You're in charge. Redundancy is one of those rare times when, no, you don't have a say in this.
Yeah.
I was incredibly lucky. And I think that, I was lucky. I can't say anything more than that. I can imagine that full position is angry. And actually, we'll come on to this. This is, again, why I wanted to talk about this episode was, I think that's really difficult. Because if you're angry, you're not in the right place the next one. I could have met a future employer on my last day of work, And I would imagine they'd have said, oh, he's pretty positive. There's someone we want on our team who is making the most of what's going on. That's kind of interesting. I'm going to say lucky once more, because I can imagine it would have been very easy for me to imagine a wrong that had been done to me personally.
Yeah.
When none of it was personal.
So I was about to say I've never been made redundant. I have, but it in a very odd way, and we can talk about that if it's relevant. But I have been in a transition where in the military, my posting had come up. I'd done my 3 years. In fact, I'd been extended. So I spent a bit longer in that job, and I had to move on, and I had to go and do something else. But I was in probably the job I most enjoyed throughout my whole 20-year career in the Marines. I had the perfect job. I loved, and when I say loved, I mean I loved my team, the people in my team, the team as a whole. We were at the top of our game. We had worked really hard for several years to get there. The organisation had gone through quite a transformation as we were shifting away from counterinsurgency operations in the Middle East to looking at what we call contingency operations, but high readiness, commandos ready to react and go around the world. So we'd refocused the organisation. The wider unit that I worked for, I thought the commander was excellent. I thought all the staff in the command structure were working really, really well, and I was happy, and I thought I was doing a really good job. And all of a sudden, not out of a surprise, but I had to move on. And I handed over the organisation to a very, very capable person. But I then watched as they did things their way and felt very frustrated, because I'm sure some of what they were doing was better than I was doing, but it was different. And I was also, just because I cared, really interested. I wanted to keep up to date with what was going on. And it was really difficult because I had a new job to do and I needed to concentrate on that. But I wanted to keep picking up the phone and just say, everything all right? Do you need any advice? Can I come down and check it out?
Because I think this is the really important, which is when you come to these transitions, how do you most effectively make that transition?
Yeah.
The last thing, which is really interesting as a personal thing, and as I say, listen, I'm in my 50s. At some point in the distant future, probably I'll retire. All of a sudden, the day after I finished, you have the question, what do I do now? And I think that in the last couple of weeks, that's been the most interesting question, because for the last 35 years of my life, that question had been answered. I would wake up, I would get up, I would look at my email, I'd grab some breakfast, and I would go to work. And so that has been really interesting, the discipline required to think about what structure can I bring my life? What is valuable activity versus busy activity? So I was talking to my wife this morning. I got up early in the morning. I went for a run. We'd taken the dogs for the walk. That's taken up most of the morning. Okay, that was important work, but not valuable work. And so it's so interesting.
Well, you described it to me yesterday as that was tactical activity, but not necessarily strategic.
Yes.
Which I was very proud of.
Well, you're very proud of it. But it's really interesting, because I think the point I'm trying to make as we sort of shift across for the last 20 minutes or so is it is easy to do these transitions poorly.
Yeah.
And it really has an impact. And maybe the summary of my experience of this so far is there is an emotional impact that you have to think about and manage. Because if I don't look after myself emotionally, when I speak to the next employer, they're going to go, he sounded like a miserable bastard.
Yeah.
Let's not hire him.
Yeah.
And genuinely, my family need me to be healthy and well and part of the family. So there's an emotional piece to it. There's a mental piece to it, which I think we're embarrassed to think about and talk about. And again, my point is this is less just about being made redundant. This is about any transition.
Yeah.
But then there's also the practical piece of things. So I wrote some notes down about what struck me as both opportunities and things I've been thinking about. The first one we talked about is the emotional impact. And again, we're maybe we're more hippie than most podcasts, most leadership podcasts. It was really important for me to acknowledge the loss. You talked about this. You had to phone up your old organization.
Yeah.
Okay. That is not acknowledging the loss.
No.
Write that down.
Yeah.
There is stress and uncertainty. So for me, I don't have a new role. Okay. That's stressful. My job in the house for my family is to earn money. There's something there. We talked about this. Was I a failure? And I actually articulated that once or twice to someone else I was with, and more broadly, I talked about with my boss, which is we should talk about this, because if we don't talk about it, there's always the risk. Did I make a difference? That was the question I asked myself. And I think that's a useful and healthy thing to do in any organization. I look back and I thought, did we achieve everything we wanted to achieve? Well, the fact that I was made redundant, arguably the answer is no. But actually, I could look back and say, here are the 6 things we did. Here are the changes we made. Here's the team, how the team had developed. That was really important as well. And also the last one was about thinking about the people you leave behind as well. How do you, again, it almost comes back to the recruitment process. The next thing that was really important to me and that struck me as part of these kinds of transitions, particularly is, and now we're back into the traditional battling with business world, which is adaptability and resilience.
Yeah.
I think this is an exercise for me in both of those things. Resilience. On January the 1st, this was not my plan for the year. Okay, I need to be resilient. And I could quite easily spend my days, we're letting you into a bit too much information, sitting in my dressing gown, watching daytime TV, eating cold baked beans out of a can. I think I could do that. In fact, I think I could be very good at that. But actually, resilience for me is all about how do I practically structure my life and my day and my work to get to the next good place. And adaptability as well. And what's been interesting for me is I've been doing this for a while. Actually, I'm doing fine, but this is quite hard.
Yeah.
The day you stop, and we'll come on to something else in a minute. That's something I'm going to be thinking about, and maybe we'll come back to in future months to talk about resilience. So practicing adaptability and resilience is a good and useful thing that I will come out stronger from this. I will practice this. I'll hone my skills. It doesn't feel like it's a good thing, but it is. The next one, though, I think is really interesting, and I've preached this to other people, and this is less about redundancy, but this is more about maybe an opportunity, and that is identity shift.
Yeah.
So here's the place to start with, which is going back to my son, my wife, me, you in the military, and all the other transitions we've talked about. Is my identity was very closely tied to the work I did.
Yeah.
And so that is really interesting. And that I realize until you're in the middle of one of those transitions, you just do not think about. And actually, I'd be willing to bet the moment you finish the transition, you're somewhere else, you stop thinking about it. But what is your identity? Who are you without this role? What is your personal identity and what is your professional identity?
Yeah, and I think there's an extension to that, which is how is your identity going to need to change as you move from one state to the other? So in the military, for example, and there's loads of sort of discussion around this, and there's probably whole podcasts on military transitions, but we have a different language. We talk about things in a very military way, and yet the underlying skills are probably fairly generic. We've covered lots of this kind of stuff on this podcast. And so as part of that transition, you have to adapt your identity to go from being able to talk about your skills to a military audience, to be able to talk about your skills to a civilian audience, to a way that a potential employer would understand without fundamentally shifting what your core values and beliefs are, or just lying about what you could be. It's about translation, not not a complete, redesign or sort of.
Well, but I want this, for me, is one of those opportunities, and it just so happens this is redundancy, but it could be the shift in role, it could be we've moved countries, all these things we talked about. Actually, this is your opportunity to change your narrative. What I don't mean is that my name was Chris and now I'm going to refer to as Bernard.
No, not at all.
But it's really interesting where we've all been there. We're in the meeting and we say something and people behave in a certain way and we say, okay, that wasn't as effective. But maybe I'm too jokey in meetings. Maybe I'm too serious in meetings. These are really unique opportunities for you to, and I'm going to use this word probably out of context, reinvent yourself.
Yes.
You literally have a new opportunity to be perceived by people in a different way. Now, that might not be that big a shift. In fact, for many people, that's not a big shift. But I think about my son moving from 18 and he's now going to go into a career. Actually, there's the young man sort of growing up into a professional man. That is his opportunity to say, I used to hang around in jeans and, listen to great music. Now I'm going to wear a sharp suit and I want people to see me in a different way. So I think this is one of the greatest opportunities in these situations for you to change the things that otherwise, if I turned up and behaved in a different way, everyone would go, why did you?
Yeah. So I think we've talked about culture before and we've talked about the iceberg sort of metaphor where you've got your surface artifacts, the jeans that you wear versus the suit that you wear. You've got then below the surface, the values that you hold. And then even deeper below that are the assumptions, the deep-seated assumptions that are what create those value systems, which ultimately result in the artifacts, the visual cues, the language you use, the mannerisms, the cultural norms. I think as you shift from one state to another, however this transition is, you're effectively acknowledging that you are moving from one culture to another culture. That doesn't mean you fundamentally change as a person. What it means is those surface level artifacts can be tweaked. And your son isn't going to suddenly wake up one day and be, a middle-aged adult having been a grubby teenager the day before. It's a slow progression. It's a slow change, but he can say, I'm now working in a professional environment and therefore I'm going to wear smarter clothes.
I just think it's one of those things that people miss, whether it's forced or unforced. This is, many people wish they could reinvent themselves. The point is you get to reinvent yourselves each day. Mums who turn up in the playground in their pajamas to get the kids done to go do something else, next week can be the smartest looking business person.
Yeah, absolutely. This context.
That identity shift, I think, it starts to show actually all the possibilities to come.
Yeah.
The next one, which I think is really interesting, and you've almost talked more about this, which is an ability to think about your skills and think about their transferability. I've actually spent my career in a number of different industries, and what that has done has helped me understand what my core skills are rather than I have a skill in this particular industry. And I think that can be really helpful to recognize the experiences. They don't vanish with the role. They carry into the next role, whether it's military discipline, project management, leadership, creativity. What I've realized, and much to the chagrin slightly of the people I've worked with, is when they say, of course, we're unique in our industry. And I'm thinking, that's really interesting. That's exactly what the last industry said.
Yeah. And it's not a very unique thing to say.
You're not unique. There clearly are differences.
Yeah.
But actually, good leadership is good leadership. Good management is good management. Good running of a business is good running of a business. Yeah. So that's really interesting. It's an opportunity to take a step back. And
And I think that's clearly from an individual perspective, there is opportunity for you in your transition. But I think as an organisation, there is opportunity in transition because this is how you cross-pollinate ideas. As you get new people in, you get fresh ideas, you get fresh perspectives, you get new cultural artifacts, if you like. You get those changes, subtle changes that are going to change the values over time. And this is why, in some respects, the military posting cycle of moving every 2 years is incredibly inefficient. It's disruptive. You have 6 months to learn the job. You effectively do it well for a year, and then you spend 6 months thinking about your next job, and long-term projects are nightmarish. There's a whole load of challenge and friction. But we also have an organisation where people have a wide range of experience in different places with different people. These are large organisations. The military is, 150,000 people plus, and yet everybody knows everybody because everybody's been everywhere. People have served in the same units. They've served on the same bases.
But again, it's this practicing adaptability, resilience,
Yeah,
your identity, identifying transferable skills. And it was interesting. This is what I'm doing right now, which is, and I can feel myself in my CV talking about the skills I've had in this role.
yeah,
And I have to practice very hard to use those as examples, but actually abstract away the overall skills. So
yeah,
I think, hope, believe I am good at building and running effective teams. Whatever that team is doing,
yeah,
effective teams. I mean, in my product management world, I think I'm good at working to understand what the customer problem is. That's very different from in this particular market or that particular role.
yes, yeah,
This
yeah.
company had this particular limitation or worked in that way.
But I think there's also a more subtle thing, which is coming from a completely different organisation. It could be in the same industry, it could be in the same sector, or not. But coming from a different organisation, not only do you have those broad generic skills of team building, leadership, project management, but you also have insight from a specific industry that you can bring across.
It's been really interesting as I've, over the years as I've interviewed, you're right, that was one of the pivot points, which was, well, we really want someone who knows the industry.
Yeah.
But we behave in a certain way, which is almost a result of working in this industry. And so we would like to now take the risk of having someone who doesn't know our industry. And that actually becomes really effective. And in fact, what I've found is it's harder to change when you're using the previous yardstick to change from.
Yes, yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's like, well, this is how we've always worked. I was in another company in this industry, and we worked that way as well because we all align. As opposed to, I've come from a different industry. You guys are crazy that you still do it this way. Here's a different way.
Yeah, I think, and there's a really, it's got nothing to do with transitions as such, but just different industries combining thoughts. If you think about the microwave oven, like the underlying technology of the microwave oven does not come from the world of thermodynamics, which is how all other heating, food, cooking things work. The microwave oven technology comes from the communications industry. And somebody noticed,
getting hotter.
Well, it actually comes from the fact that people operating communication systems noticed that they weren't effective or as effective when it rained. And so they realized that the energy was being absorbed by water. And that led to a thought of, well, if it's absorbing water, it must be transferring the energy to the water. And then somebody in the communications industry had this wonderful idea of, could we build a machine that could heat water? Not somebody in the food cooking industry. It's a really trite example, but it's this example of
it's about having that
why coming from one organisation or one culture to another is really important. So bringing it out from the individual going through the transition to the organisations managing transitions.
And it's interesting, that is something which, as I now start to talk to other organisations, that is really exciting to me, which is you've got problems which I recognise, but which are different forms of the same problem.
Yes,
so it's my experience, your experience to approach the different way. Last couple of things as well that just struck me, and then we'll finish up. Networks and community is really important. The role of mentors, colleagues, family, and professional networks is so, so important. And I think sometimes you think in terms of particularly looking for a new role, it's really, really important that you have a large group of people that you can go and talk to, particularly in my line of work. So that was really, really interesting. Funnily enough, this is something for me to work on. I've never cultivated networks.
Yeah.
I'm not a networky person. I think talked about this where that's just not my thing. And yet I realize now actually that's where the opportunities come from. So maybe anyone listening out there thinks, I don't cultivate my networks. I don't go onto LinkedIn. I don't reach out to people I've worked with or work to build new connections. It'd be really, really important.
And I went through exactly the same thing when I transitioned out of the military. For all of my career, had not really bothered with networking in any kind of formal or deliberate way.
It feels a bit dirty.
It felt a bit wanky, to be honest. And networking events, and we're going to do some networking, and I roll my eyes. And it was only as I transitioned, and I'm very lucky, as I said, the military has very strong cultural ties and bonds, and I had a network, but not deliberately, and I hadn't worked at it, and I didn't really know who in my network could be useful, or I just had a really large informal group of ex-colleagues and friends that had sort of some similar life experience. It was only having gone through the transition that I realised how important it was, by which point it's too late. And so I think there's an onus on organisations to develop their people and to get them to build their networks.
That's such an interesting point. I'd not thought of it as it is the organisation's role to encourage that kind of thing. But you're absolutely right, because not only is it valuable for your employees to have those connections for themselves, but of course it's really valuable to have those connections for the organization, for new ideas, for new talent, for new ways of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's always this sort of short-termism that pushes against this idea of encouraging people to network. Because what if they get a job offer outside? Well, people are going to get job offers. People are going to, and it's the same as training. Like if we invest in training and then they leave, you're going to upskill people. They're going to grow in experience and knowledge, and then they might.
Richard Branson that said if you train people, you train them not because you want them to stay, but because
he said
they'll want to stay rather.
I think
I did a very bad.
He said organisations say, "What if I train people and then they leave?" And his answer to that is, "What if you don't train them and they stay?" And the point is that it is collectively better for the system if we are all getting better all the time, and we are upskilling our value. And of course, your son coming out of dirty teenage sort of hanging around and smelling. Well, I'm tarring him with a brush, but to adulthood is the fresh blood coming into. So as we all progress, develop, network, gain experience, move on, transition, people are coming behind us, and that constant churn of new blood, new ideas, new perspectives is what creates productivity and growth, not in an organisation, but in a community.
So the last thing I've got, and this is probably a good way to sort of round us off for today. Again, I'll reiterate, clearly, as you can tell, this is something that's very personal, that's happening to me at the moment and is a big thing in my life. But genuinely, this is true of all transitions. Many of the things we talked about are just a bit more obvious and a bit more visceral in this particular situation, but they're true for all of them. And that is the opportunity lens. And I suspect I could be accused of being optimistic or always seeing the sunny side. But actually, I think this is pragmatically the only way to be. Reframing your change, your disruption, whatever it might be, in my case, redundancy, my son in his life, it is a chance to reset priorities. It is a chance to explore passions, shift directions, find the next opportunity. And I think that is difficult sometimes to see the wood for the trees, but it is exactly what it is. I am pretty sure, you can never 100% predict these things, in a year's time, I'll have a really exciting role that I'm getting my teeth into with a new team where I'm learning new things, where the team is benefiting from my experience. It is all about how do you make the most of that opportunity?
Yeah.
For those of you who say, well, that's all just a bit trying to put a positive spin on things, every single transition I have gone through in the past, leaving school, joining the military, leaving the military, going between organizations, has brought me to where I am today. And therefore, by definition, they made up the rich recipe of what I am today. And so therefore, it really is an opportunity. And last thought on this, which is, change is rarely bad. At the time, it can feel bad, and at times it can feel scary. But actually, change and bringing new things inevitably and typically, invariably brings good things. And if it doesn't, change again. That's the magic of these things. If I go to another organization and it's not right for me, well, then I can leave and go for. But actually, change is really exciting. So, finishing up this episode for me, and I recognize this has been hopefully interesting, hopefully a little bit of businessy, but obviously this is as much sort of
A
catharsis for
counselling
me.
session for you.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
I'm actually really excited for the future.
Mm.
I have a whole new set of opportunities in front of me. I don't know what they are, and that can be quite worrying at times. But actually, if I do the right thing, I am going to open up a whole new set of opportunities that might be the same or might be different. And that's really important to keep hold of, because if we go back, I think inevitably there hasn't been a transition that hasn't made me stronger or wiser or in some ways happier. So
Yeah.
difficult situation, but actually there's a really positive opportunity there. And actually that's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, I think you've said some really, really important things there. The core sort of theme that runs through all of our episodes, I think, is the reality that success isn't something you can roadmap. Success is a combination of a whole load of things you can work at, things you can develop at, but ultimately it's things you have to develop, grow, get feedback, and think about whilst doing. That's as an organization or as a leader or as an individual. And change is part of that growth program or that growth. So as an individual going through a transition, it's really pleasing that you see it as an opportunity. During the moment when it's happening, it can quite often feel very scary, very overwhelming, very risky. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know what's coming next. But more often than not, it is the stepping stone to moving on to greater things.
It's also how you make that stepping stone
Yes.
to better things, rather than I'm crossing my fingers that something good.
Absolutely.
It's controlling the next thing I might not be able to control when that happens.
But I think,
but the next thing that happens will be something that's exciting.
Yes. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that lots of people are going through this.
Yeah.
And collectively, this is how organizations change and grow and develop. So it feels inefficient. It feels like unwanted friction, whether this is because you had to restructure or because people have decided to move on to bigger and better things and you wanted to keep them and now you can't, or whether it's because you've got to get rid of somebody because they're not performing. These are all opportunities. You are allowing people to move on because they're not performing, where they can find a better niche or a better role, or they can learn and grow. You're allowing people to move on because they want to go and do bigger and better things. So you're allowing them to go and do better things collectively. Or you are restructuring because of a shift that you need to make. All three of those present opportunities. All three of those present challenge. But I would say an organization that isn't facing these transitions, isn't facing these changes, is not a learning organization. And one thing we know is that in a dynamic world, organizations that don't learn and grow tend to fail.
I think that's absolutely right. And I'm hoping none of the people listening have been made redundant recently. But if you have been made redundant or you are in an organization where this is happening, hopefully this is just giving you a little bit of an insight about how it feels on both sides. And hopefully it gives you a little bit of how I'm thinking about it so that I don't end up sitting on the sofa in my dressing gown eating cold baked beans in a can, which I can be very clear my good lady wife would not accept as an answer.
I would also argue that would not be moving on to bigger and better things.
Do you not think so?
No.
What if it was really good daytime TV?
Maybe.
Yeah. All right. On that bombshell that I'm not allowed to watch daytime TV, which has totally ruined this afternoon's activities. Let's call it for today, Gareth. Thank you very much for indulging me on that topic, although I think it's kind of an interesting, more broad topic. If you have enjoyed this, then please do like and subscribe, as I believe the young people say. But if this is the first time you've heard an episode of Battling with Business, or you've heard previous episodes, please go back and hit subscribe. So every Thursday, an episode arrives in your inbox. We are also available, and we publish all the new episodes when they arrive in Twitter. We are on Blue Sky. We're also on, well, each of us on our own individual names on LinkedIn. We can be contacted, and please do tell us, we witter on sometimes about these topics like transitions. Please do let us know if this was an interesting topic or not an interesting topic, whether there was something you agree or disagree with, or indeed if you think there are other topics that you'd like us to talk about or explore or investigate. We'll leave you now, but I'm very excited as we finish this recording. Myself and Gareth have got, I think it's about 6 or 7 really exciting guests that we're trying to lock down. We've got a couple of trips out to meet them in person. We've got some folks that will be contacting remotely, but we've got some really, really interesting interviews coming up. And of course, once a month, we do our influencer session. So please do stick around for that. And last but not least, if you've enjoyed this, please annoy like-minded friends and suggest Battling with Business to them. But for now, I think that probably covers us all, Gareth.
No, I think that's very well said. And I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.